thank you for the interesting talk. I would now like to invite Ken to the stage to answer some of the questions will be posted by the audience. In your talk, you speak a lot about the lies, the white lies that you sometimes perform, and the bigger lies. Can you give us an insight of the biggest lie you have ever encountered?
You could have prepared me for that one. Oh, I don't know. I think part of the problem with any thematic map is the gap between what the map maker thinks that they're showing an audience and what that audience is actually going to get from the map. So whether it's a lie or not, it's a gap, and it's a gap in knowledge transfer or information transfer. I mean, you can call it a lie if you want. That's sometimes quite a loaded word when we're talking about trying to portray information anyway. But it's those maps where I think maybe we're lying to ourselves. We're trying to convince ourselves that we're showing people, a great map or a great visualization, and it's perhaps not doing the job we think it's doing, for all sorts of reasons, often many reasons which, we're not even aware of.
Okay. I think that's a
sophisticated answer. I got out of that one, yeah.
Even though you were unprepared, I think it was good. There has been some discussion in the chat about using grayscale and monochrome. With one person commenting that diverging balance shouldn't work in grayscale. Can you give us some insights on how you work around these challenges?
So for me, it's you should always take into consideration these accessibility issues for a wide variety of different scenarios. And yes, color, as the previous speakers were talking about, is a really crucial element of that, and one that's often overlooked. And so, whenever I'm making maps, I put them through various different tools to make sure that for different people with different vision, they're going to be able to interpret them in the way in which I hope they can, and the way in which I mean it. Now, when you get to something like a map of political data, where the colors do have actually very, very significant meaning, and people do base a lot of their seeing and understanding from their innate knowledge of what the colors mean, I think we get into some interesting territory. So I could have made all of the maps work in grayscale, where one side of the diverging scheme is noticeably different to the other. But then you create maybe 100 maps or however many that don't work for maybe 95 or 98% of your audience. So to me, it was a balance. I checked the reds and the blues that I was using, and they were tweaked very carefully so that you could see gradations between each color as well. And they worked for virtually all of the visual deficiencies tested for, bar one. And I thought that was enough, to be able to cater for the vast majority of different vision. So, in an ideal world, yes, you create something that everybody can see. I totally agree with that. But when color is actually very important for the subject matter, I think sometimes you have to also, keep that in mind, and, balance the needs of the many as well.
Okay, thank you for that. Moving on to this topic about, you say you always check all your visualizations for the different visual impairments that could be happening. In line with that, can you expand on how to recognize bias when you're looking at maps?
Well, I think actually, one of the key texts recently has been Alberto Cairo's, How Charts Lie, and that backs up or follows on from what Marc Monnier was writing about 30 or 35 years ago in how maps lie, which is this idea of trying to acknowledge that there's two sides to this entire issue. It's all very well making great visualizations and great maps, but the other side of the coin is people's ability to be able to read them. And I've heard a number of talks and where people have said, well, a lot of it comes down to education and people becoming more aware of what they're reading and what they're consuming. And this goes back to 1950s and thereabouts with ideas of graphicacy. In addition to numeracy, literacy, articulacy, there's this need for graphical understanding. So recognizing bias in maps, I think as practitioners, we should be able to do it. It's part of the job. It's part of the job of trying to present the data in as truthful a way as you can, unless your job is specifically to create persuasive maps, and there are people with those kinds of roles. How we actually get a consumer to see bias in a map, I think only comes through education. But I would say that the last 2 years, I think, have been an education for all, with the proliferation of maps and graphics in the media in particular, and the proliferation of comments, advice, critique that many of us in the field have offered to news agencies and the like. I think the diet of maps and graphics in the popular media has improved immeasurably. And so what you then get is a knock-on effect. I think people become more accustomed to seeing better work as opposed to poorer work. And that in turn, perhaps, hopefully, raises expectations and perhaps gives them a better understanding of kind of what to expect when they're looking at a map, or at least be able to question it a little bit more rather than just tacitly consuming it and interpreting it on face value.
So you're saying like we're basically for the past 2 years have been educated by need because of the pandemic. Do you feel like having these kind of like data viz and how to read these kind of maps should be more standard curriculum rather than having to do?
Yeah, I absolutely do. And this, like I said a moment ago, this idea of graphicacy is not new, and it sort of keeps coming back at points of inflection where it becomes critical that people are able to read and understand this information rather than just simply consume what they're being told. I would like this sort of material to get into school level, not just university, but before that, and to be part of people's education, not just maps, but graphs, charts, all visualizations, all visual forms of information. I think it would help tremendously if people were more articulate in being able to read this material. But like I said, I think by a process of osmosis, I've seen the last couple of years, certainly in mapping, as a bit of a golden age, or another golden age of cartography, where we're seeing many more maps. And if you take maybe the last decade or so in terms of web mapping, you go back to early web maps, and there were some real horrors. There was some people experimenting with maps and creating some pretty poor work that is very difficult to interpret. I think the proportion of what you might call a poor or a weak map compared to what's pretty good out there now has changed dramatically. Most maps I see now are on another planet compared to even 10 years ago. They're actually pretty well formed. They take note of some basic tenets, basic guidelines. They get to a pretty good outcome relatively well. And the maps that perhaps don't do such a good job are fewer and far between, I think. So I think, as Andy said in the state of the industry earlier today, I think it's in really good health, and I would include maps within that.
Okay. Next on, we move to a more technical question, and I'm going to read it out loud because I'm not sure you understand. For the isometric map with the 3D bars, the improved one, if some of the bars are in the background and some of them in the foreground, how can you control for that type of distortion? For example, the bars in Texas are in the foreground and the Washington State bars are in the background.
Okay, so that's a trick of the projection used, and I don't mean a flat two-dimensional projection. I mean a 3D projection. So it's an isometric axonometric projection, which basically equalizes scale across the entire map from foreground to background. If you've ever seen Herman Bollman's map of New York, or Konstantin Anderson's map of New York, or even Turgot's Plan de Paris, they use the same trick for physical features. So the buildings in the foreground look exactly the same scale as buildings in the background as you read the map up the sheet. So this is exactly the same, but it just happens to use statistical data and prisms. Although somebody said I sounded like I said prisons. I don't know, maybe, but prisms. So they are equivalent. So you can measure, literally get a ruler out and measure a foreground bar and then a background bar, and they are equal to one another. Now, people probably won't do that, but it means that anybody looking at that map is going to make a reasonably correct assumption about how one place is relative to another place, in a way in which the curved surface version with prisms sticking up all over the place and perspective and foreshortening doesn't. So it's just a trick to use a different way in which to represent 3D data that we can deploy when we're creating the map, that makes the assumptions that the reader makes correct. And I don't see why we wouldn't do that to help the reader and to not create bigger problems for the map reader.
Thank you very much. So in your answer just now, you're tapping into kind of like basic perception of the human. And this kind of taps into our next question. One of our attendees noticed that what's interesting is that I've seen a lot of math and charty activities in the preschool, recommendations for my toddler. But does that focus shift away in the elementary school curriculum?
I don't know, because I'm from the UK. So my knowledge of the US school system is probably not what it should be. My daughter went through the UK system, so I can't really comment on the US system. I think my general point still stands, though, that if you're going to introduce things like this in early school years, you need to follow them through, and that might even help to perhaps bring back university level courses. I mean, I know in the UK there's no cartography courses left at university level, and I think that's partly because there isn't many people coming through with the idea that, well, that's an interesting career, and I might want to study that at an advanced level. And maybe that's true for data visualization in general. I just think, the more people are exposed to it throughout their education, the better informed they're going to be, whether they actually want to go into the field themselves and create and make and deliver, or whether they're just reading to become better able to pass that information when it crosses their eyes.
Okay. Then we move on to a more broader question. What is the highest numbers of dimensions or variables that you have conveyed in the map?
I think that's a great question. It's in the hundreds, but it's absolutely impossible to disentangle. So, sometimes I'll make a map just because technically it's feasible, but I'll use that map as an example of pretty much what not to do. That's not to say, though, that maps need to be boiled down to the simplest possible way of representing something. I think we also need to understand that map readers are not just, simple beings only able to understand simple concepts. I think we can present complex multivariate information. Bivariate choropleths are a good example, and you wouldn't necessarily have any more than 3 or 4 classes on each of the 2 axes, because then you suddenly create a massive matrix of colors that are difficult to disentangle. But 2 variables or even a trivariate choropleth is feasible. 2 different maps, maybe a choropleth with proportional symbols on top. So I think there are ways of designing a map that you can easily convey several variables. There's one in the book that I didn't show today, which is a remake of one from the Washington Post, who made a mountain landscape. So each county had sort of a triangular symbol, and the height of the symbol, the width of the base of the symbol, the thickness of the line, the transparency, the color, they very quickly got to 6 or 7 different variables, and it worked. And so it's a case of being able to create symbology that works in a way that is sympathetic to what you're trying to do, rather than masking it. That Chernoff face map I showed, I think is an example of a map that doesn't work. It's far too complicated, notwithstanding some of the issues surrounding Chernoff faces as a symbology type anyway. There's all sorts of discussions and debates about whether that's even a suitable mechanism to be representing socioeconomic data.
Okay, thank you very much. For our last question, someone asked, can you recommend us other learning resources for map styling and design? So what kind of learning resources would you recommend?
Well, okay, so this will sound a little bit like a plug, for which I apologize, but I mean, the maps I make have been turned into a book, as I mentioned. The company I work for allowed me to create a MOOC on cartography. So you can go to, I'll put it in the Word doc, the notes, which we've currently delivered the MOOC. It's a 6-week free course. We've delivered that to about 150,000 people globally over the last few years. The next course starts in a couple of weeks, actually. So there's that. But I mean, there's plenty more other than anything that I'm involved in. Twitter's a great place to look for resources. You can follow all sorts of other societies like the North American Cartographic Information Society, NACIS, or the British Cartographic Society, or there's equivalent societies in most continents that you can tap into. And I would find people on Twitter or other social media who are reasonably well acknowledged in those areas, and you just siphon through those sorts of links and you'll easily find resources. Or people can contact me directly if they want to. I'm more than happy to help them.
Okay, thank you very much. So there are still some questions in the doc, so if you have any time, please feel free to answer them. And I would like to thank you for now for this beautiful Q&A and your very interesting talk. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks very much. Enjoy the rest of the conference.